Yeah, the community exchange system came into being officially in 2003, but of course the origins of it go back much further than that. In fact, we had the thing running in 2002 as a kind of test thing for about 6 months. But even beyond that, you know, it's actually quite an ancient idea, this idea of trading without using conventional money. There's a whole movement called LETS. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's Local Exchange Trading System, and that started in the early 1980s. Actually in Canada, a guy kind of invented the system, but even he was really just reviving an ancient idea. People have done this really for thousands of years in very small closed communities, just by keeping a kind of record of what people have done. And you could simply do that in a regular, you know, paper ledger book. You would just record on the one side the credits that someone, the various people in the community had earned, and on the other side the debits, and you could just add it up and just keep a record like that. But let's sort of formalize this into a sort of movement. The very first groups were, again, just paper-based. They used just ledgers, and then later on in the 80s, when PC started to become more common, if you remember, the first PC only really came out in about 1981. It's proper PC. I mean, there were sort of toy computers before that. People started to develop little accounting programs that made life a bit easier, meaning you didn't have to write it all down and make mistakes and keep adding it up with a calculator all the time. And the computer would just keep a record of all these transactions. But these were very centralized systems. Obviously there was no internet in the 1980s, and so the accounting software would simply be on one central computer, and usually that computer was operated by the administrator of the group. And these groups simply got off the ground by someone giving a talk somewhere and inviting people to join, and they would just keep a register of the members, and often they required a kind of membership fee in order to cover the costs, because everything was still on paper. They would print regular, say every 3 or 6 months, they'd print a paper directory or kind of little yellow pages where everybody advertised their offerings, and those would be distributed by post, simply post them out to everybody. So all that costed money, so it was legitimate to charge conventional money for that. But then all the trading in the group took place, and people would use simple paper checks, and they would bring those checks to a central point, and then the administrator would sit with this pile and enter them into the computer. And then again they would issue, maybe monthly or every 6 months, they'd issue a statement of account to everybody so that they knew where they were, what their standing was, so that you could also check up on the balances of other people, so you could be sure that some people were not taking or others were not giving too much, and this kind of regulated the whole thing. Then in the 1990s, as the internet took off, you found that some of these groups started to experiment with putting this accounting system on the internet. But still they were kind of still very, well, they weren't linked together. It was just like one group would have its database on the internet, and members could then go there. Instead of printing out paper directories, they could simply go to the website and look at the list of offerings there. But these were still very much standalone groups. And I was involved in 1993 in Johannesburg. There was set up South Africa's first Let's group, but it was pretty much the traditional type. Everything was still paper-based, although they had an accounting software, and I think they could even use something like a spreadsheet to record all the trades. And it wasn't terribly successful because it was very much a middle-class thing. It was just very localized, and the kind of offerings were not very exciting, and over time it just kind of, wouldn't say collapsed, it just faded away as fewer people used it. And then in about 2000 I was involved with a group called the South African New Economics Network, SANE, and they for a long time had been talking about starting a Let's group in Cape Town. And I personally had been playing around with this idea on the internet myself. I developed some basic software which I was testing out. Strangely, might seem a bit strange. I do a lot of hiking, and hikers, as you know, it's a very social activity, and people used to advertise what they do in real life, like maybe I do burglar alarms and someone else does painting and someone else is a psychiatrist. And the committee said, let's put together a database of everybody's what they do, and then we could circulate that, and then we could all use the services of everybody in the hiking club, and thought that would be nice. And I offered to do that because I was doing the website. And then I thought I'd put on a little trading feature as well. Again, it wasn't terribly successful because this was not really the right constituency. These were not people who were sort of ideological. Hikers are just there for a bit of fun. But anyway, it allowed me to develop the software, and then I got involved with SANE, and I showed them the software I developed, and we decided to try that out as a method of running this group. And it was internet-based, and it was just set up in 2002 for this group in South Africa. And we started off with about 20 members. And we just held a meeting and people came along and they joined. And we started trading with each other. And in the beginning the trading was very slow because there was only 20 people and not very much on offer. And slowly it grew, and we decided to have a kind of stall at a regular sort of greeny market here in Cape Town. And we often had some products on display, and people would come up and say, well, how much is that? And we'd say 25 talents, and they'd say, excuse me, and then we'd have a computer there and we'd explain the whole thing to them, and they would join up, and they'd walk off with, say, a box of vegetables or some, some soap or hand powder or hand cream or something. They'd actually get something without paying money for it, and those people, because they experienced that straight away, that kind of giving without having to give any money, they've become some of the best members that we ever developed. And so we started, and this thing grew, and eventually after about a year we reached 100 members, and then it really started to take off. Once the numbers increased, you reach a kind of critical mass, a certain point where the thing just runs itself. You don't have to go to markets anymore. I mean, we started having our own markets, but you didn't have to go and advertise. It didn't really, it passed around by word of mouth. One person, everybody realised that the more people who are involved in this thing, the better it is for everybody, because then there's more stuff available, more services available, and it's just obvious that the bigger it is, the better it works. So, yeah, it just grew and grew. And then after about the first year, some folks in Joburg had heard about this thing, or I think there were actually some people from Cape Town who moved up to Joburg, and they wanted to start one there. So we started a second one in Johannesburg, but again it was a completely standalone thing. Although it was running off the same web server, the Cape Town group couldn't trade with the Johannesburg group because they were just completely isolated things. And the way it works is that nothing can leave the system in terms of the accounting, because it's a closed system. Every debit has a credit and every credit has a debit. So the entire system, if you add up all the figures, it must come to zero. And obviously if any of those figures leave and go across to Johannesburg, then there would be a deficit of numbers on the one side and a surplus on the other side, and the accounting would get messed up. So it took us a while to work out how we could actually trade between these groups, because we were always faced with this problem of the accounting on each side had to balance to zero. And then we hit on this idea that if somebody could have an account in both places, then in a sense that if someone on this side wanted to sell something to someone in Johannesburg, they could do it through the mediation of this person who had two accounts. So in fact you would sell your stuff not to that person in the remote exchange, but to that person who has two accounts. So that keeps the accounting in that side. That person steps across, as it were, to the other side, and sells it on then to the ultimate buyer, and that would keep the accounting there. Okay. All right, so once we worked out the mechanism of being able to trade between different exchanges, then this thing really started to take off, because then people in other places heard about it, and we started one in Johannesburg and one in East London and one in Port Elizabeth, and we could now all trade with each other. So I could even go to Port Elizabeth, and I wouldn't have to earn credits there in order to spend them, as it were, to obtain, say, accommodation in Port Elizabeth. If someone was advertising there, I could simply go there and in effect pay them, or they could debit my account in Cape Town. So in other words, in a sense, I was paying them from what I'd earned in Cape Town, and could acquire services or goods in a remote place. And because this thing was on the internet, there was a lot of blurb about it, and the idea spread. And then in Australia and New Zealand, this Let scheme that I talked about earlier was really big, and there were hundreds of groups over there. And especially in New Zealand, they heard about it and thought this would be fantastic if they could trade, because it's a small island and people move around. And the entire set of Let's groups in New Zealand joined our system, so that gave it a huge boost, because now we could even trade with New Zealand. And we had all these separate groups all over New Zealand, and they could now trade with each other and with us. And then after that it just sort of took off, and then the Australians heard about it, and then the Americans heard about it, and then everybody heard about it. And today we now have nearly 250 of these exchange groups around the world. In, I think at the last count it was 17 or maybe 19 different countries. I've lost track of it myself. But in other words, you can travel all around the world, and people have done that. One of our board members travelled to New Zealand and to Australia, and he went all around, and he got accommodation and transport and food and all kinds of things simply with the credits that he earned in Cape Town. He actually went into debit, so when he came back to Cape Town he had to work that off. But that's the way the system works, and he travelled, I wouldn't say all the way, and it did everything on the exchange system, but he did a lot of things, and he made a lot of good friends, and he's still in communication with them, which is very different to how it would be if he was paying rands or dollars or travellers' checks. He would simply get accommodation in some hotel in New Zealand, and he would never know those people ever again. But this way, you actually, every time you trade, you make a friend. So that's really how it grew, and today we've actually seen an exponential growth of this thing, especially since 2008. As the global economy tanks, this thing just in the opposite direction is taking off. And every time there's a flutter in the global economy, we just get a whole lot more registrations. So in a sense, well, this is a common phenomenon. We saw this whenever there's a downturn, that people look for alternative ways of doing money, especially in the 1930s and the Great Depression. There was a whole number of these things springing up all over the world, especially in the United States and in Europe. But after a while, these things were suppressed. Today, it would be very much more difficult for the state to suppress these things. They might see them as a threat, but because they're kind of internet-based, there's nothing really you can do about them. And I foresee tremendous growth, as this idea catches on, and we introduce all kinds of other forms of exchanging, maybe direct bartering and gift economies and all kinds of other ways that people do exchange things. We can bring them all together into a more sort of woolly thing, but an alternative way of exchanging or trading without using conventional money.